Imagine that humanity has landed on a distant planet with thriving nature and even an amazing intelligent civilization. The incredible discoveries would probably last us for about 500 years. Well, actually, this actually happened the very 500 years ago. Of course, that's a metaphor, alluding to Europeans first landing in South America. But the metaphors end there, and reality begins. A reality that is sometimes hard to believe. The Amazon rainforest spans 5.5 million square kilometers and is twice the size of the surface area of the dwarf planet Ceres. Even after centuries of exploration, its nature continues to astonish. Pink river dolphins alone deserve a special mention. New species of animals and plants are constantly being discovered here. It's almost as if we've landed on another planet, a garden of treasure, a living kaleidoscope of mysteries. Moreover, this dense wilderness bears traces of ancient civilizations that stretch the limits of our imagination. People from that very civilization still live in these forests today, but they avoid contact. It's as if they know something about us, something unsettling that we don't even know about ourselves. Somewhere in this region, conquerors looked for the mythical golden city of El Dorado. Maybe it does exist after all. Could the indigenous people be carefully hiding it, which is why they avoid contact? We are embarking on a journey through the Amazon rainforests to unravel these mysteries. Perhaps we'll even find out where the hell is El Dorado. What secrets lie within the expansive, uncharted depths of the Amazon rainforest? You're undoubtedly familiar with the Nazca lines. They are truly remarkable, but there's something even more significant and perhaps even more mysterious in the Amazon. In 1980, in the state of Acre in western Brazil, people were engaged in their preferred activity that would soon pose a real threat to the planet: logging. However, the trees were primarily cut down not for timber, but to clear land for agriculture. Surprisingly, this situation presents a bitter irony linking us to the ancient civilizations that lived here thousands of years ago. As the story unfolds, you'll understand what this means. So, deforestation continued until the workers encountered a strange obstacle. Initially perceived as natural, its peculiar characteristics became apparent as the work progressed. At one point, people were stunned, realizing the bigger picture, as if solving a jigsaw puzzle. Jennifer Watling, an archaeologist from the University of Sao Paulo in Brazil, shared the details of these events and subsequent research in a series of interviews. At that time, she led the investigation of the unexpectedly uncovered phenomenon as a postdoctoral researcher at the University of Exeter in the UK. Initially, the workers discovered strange trenches, remarkably straight, as though dug by an excavator, but done so many years ago, clearly long before impassable jungles and forests appeared and changed the landscape several generations ago. But there's more. As the deforestation continued, these trenches turned out to be part of larger, variously shaped figures, including geometrically precise ones, like circles, squares, rectangles, and even their combinations. There was no doubt that these were man-made. Such objects are called geoglyphs. Rapidly, similar figures were discovered throughout the region, quickly numbering into the hundreds. Currently, there have been found about 500 objects. But unlike the Nazca lines, these newly discovered shapes were much more substantial. While the Nazca Desert's etchings were drawn with lines averaging 135 centimeters in width and 25 to 50 centimeters in depth, the Amazonian geoglyphs are considerably larger. In fact, they're so large, the word drawings doesn't seem fitting. The figure's lines consist of trenches up to 36 feet, 11 meters wide, and up to 13 feet, 4 meters deep. Along the trenches, embankments were formed from the same excavated soil, and they are quite different in scale, with the largest reaching up to 300 meters long, the equivalent of 3 stadiums. In the 1980s, scientists fairly quickly determined the age of these figures. They were dug at different times between the 1st and 15th centuries, meaning that the oldest objects were about 2,000 years old. Thanks to the trench's massive scale, these figures have survived multiple generations of changing forests. But what ancient civilization created them? And more importantly, why? Stay tuned for when we reveal the answer to this question. But first, we need to tell you something else. Geoglyphs helped to uncover the history of these forests, which turned out to be pretty unexpected and surprising. Jenny Watling and her team examined soil samples taken at different geoglyph sites at a depth of 5 feet, 1.5 meters. They were interested in the presence of stable carbon isotopes, whose content could reveal the dominant vegetation type from thousands of years ago. Additionally, they sought phytoliths, microscopic plant remains that often help scientists identify specific ancient species. The results were quite unexpected. Firstly, it turned out that bamboo has been growing quite abundantly here for 6,000 years. This suggests the ecosystem's resilience to climate change. This finding was somewhat puzzling, given that neighboring Bolivia transformed into a savanna around 6,000 years ago. Savanna is a large open space where large vegetation is scarce, and there are notably fewer trees. Of course, there are plenty of forests now, but it wasn't always like this. The second peculiarity involved palm trees, which thrived in this area for approximately 3,000 years. But why is this peculiar? The fact is that local species of palm trees coexist quite poorly with large, long-living trees. Palms grow fast, but over the years cannot withstand competition from trees that grow slowly but eventually overpower palms with their extensive root system and overshadowing canopy. All of this sounded nothing like the savanna that should have been here for millennia. Where does this discrepancy come from? The answer is simple. People came to this area about 4,000 years ago, but that's only half of the story. You might think that people deliberately cultivated trees here, because that's the first thing that comes to mind. In fact, this is where things get curiouser and curiouser. Wait till you hear the whole story. Jenny Watling's team found layers of charcoal in the soil, indicative of periodic large-scale fires. The people of that time probably struggled to survive such recurring calamities. Well, not really. After all, they instigated these fires intentionally. So ancient people didn't plant trees here, but in fact burned large areas of the forest on purpose? What nonsense! But why? Actually, doing so was much more rational than it seems. As we've mentioned earlier, palm trees struggle to coexist with larger trees over time, but they do grow rapidly. That's the whole secret. Ancient people needed palms as a source of food and building materials. In contrast, large trees were much less useful, and on the scale of several generations, they were seen as cumbersome weeds by prehistoric agronomists. This is how ancient people periodically reset tree populations, with forest fires being nothing more than agricultural technology. Trees and palms burned together, but they quickly recovered. In fact, palms were the first ones to regrow after such fires. This is the bitter irony we've mentioned earlier. Ancient people destroyed forests, as do we, but we do it on a truly threatening scale, and often prefer not to bother with restoring them. But let's move on. The current composition of the forests suggests that such a radical palm cultivation method hasn't been used here for hundreds of years. Indeed, the the study of geoglyphs revealed that they've been abandoned for a long time. People left here about 650 years ago. Going back to geoglyphs, all the described studies have shown that these objects weren't created overnight. People had been living here for about 2,000 years before coming up with the idea to construct these strange objects. And with about 500 of them discovered so far, the number is truly astonishing. Watling found that people grew corn and squash near these earth structures, but archaeologists didn't find any evidence of villages or even permanent dwellings. However, there were signs that some rituals were performed in the area. Pottery fragments, remains of ornaments, and other characteristic artifacts were found at the site. Unfortunately, that's where our knowledge ends. For decades, scientists have strived to solve the mysteries of the Amazonian geoglyphs. Unfortunately, for the most part, the purpose of these objects and the meaning behind them remain a mystery, and there's no one to ask. Or is there? Indeed, if people have been living in this region for thousands of years, doing some large-scale farming, where the hell did they go? Paradoxically, the answer is quite simple and complex at the same time. Let's go into more detail. At the time Europeans first settled in what is now Brazil, approximately 4 million indigenous people lived there. This population has since decreased by about 8 times. The reasons are obvious: direct extermination during the Great Conquests, diseases, and assimilation. Most of Brazil's indigenous peoples now lead a somewhat exotic life, which is more or less similar to ours. However, the size of the country in general, and the Amazon forests in particular, turned out to be large enough for human communities to survive in the jungles of the Great River, managing to avoid contact with modern civilization until quite recently. Tribes of indigenous people have repeatedly relocated for various reasons. The Amazon rainforest is a vast world of its own. Thus, tribes may not frequently encounter each other. They no longer dig geoglyphs, but their lifestyle, if altered since ancient times, hasn't fundamentally changed. But the mere desire to avoid contact is not enough. Indigenous peoples would have faced extinction if civilized people, if I may say so, had not come to their senses in time. In Brazil, there exists a special organization called the National Indian Foundation, FUNAI. This is a federal government body that determines and executes state policy regarding the indigenous population in accordance with the Brazilian Constitution. In the 1960s and 1970s, upon discovering such tribes, the government attempted to enact an assimilation policy. However, this approach underwent a significant shift in 1987, when FUNAI established a separate department to create the so-called indigenous territories. These are essentially reservations where tribes that refuse contact live undisturbed and keep up their way of life. One of these territories was established in the Havari Valley, Vale do Havari, an area previously known only for several meteorite falls in 1930. You need to understand that this is more than just a valley. It's an expansive area, the size of South Carolina. The region is named after the Havari River, which has marked the border with Peru since 1851. It includes a large part of the municipality of Adelaide Norte, as well as adjacent lands in the western part of the Amazonas state. Besides the Havari, several other rivers also cross it. It's a quite favorable place to live, at least for indigenous peoples. This fragment of the Amazon rainforest was designated for the habitation of several uncontacted tribes, including Marubos, Matis, Kanamari, and others. The total population exceeds 6,000 people. The exact number is difficult to establish for obvious reasons. Interestingly, The presence of indigenous peoples in these areas was long doubted until a fortunate accident proved otherwise. Funai officials were searching for poachers in this area, which was already an official nature preserve. About 190 miles into the territory, the officials stumbled upon a previously unknown tribe. It turned out that these people had never had any contact with the outside world. The news was a sensation in scientific circles, as so-called uncontacted tribes are a rare phenomenon in the modern world. But as it turned out, it was just the beginning of incredible discoveries. It was later revealed that this tribe was far from the only one in the Vale do Javari. Despite the surge of scientific interest that rekindled in Funai after this find, scientists understood that research would have to be conducted with minimal contact with the tribes, ideally avoiding contact altogether. The issue is not limited to preserving the authenticity of these cultures. The problem lies in the real danger to the health and lives of these people. One of the main threats the outside world poses to indigenous people is diseases that could wipe them out. Their immune system is not adapted to most of the diseases that we tolerate easily or asymptomatically. This is why Brazilian authorities legislatively prohibit visiting the valley, except in some special cases. Scientists are thereby constrained to rely on aerial observations and compare data from previous years. Unfortunately, those in pursuit of quick profits rarely exhibit the same regard for the law as scientists. Illegal logging persists in these areas, along with aggressive farming and mining of natural resources. According to Fabrício Amorim from Funai, this region holds the highest concentration of isolated groups in the Amazon and the world. As before, these groups remain perilously close to extinction in spite of the authorities' concerted efforts. Of course, indigenous peoples live not only in Vale do Javari. The vast Amazon basin serves as home to many other tribes. For example, we have quite a lot of data on the Himarima people, or Himarima. This is also a completely isolated tribe on the Amazon basin, living along the Piranhas River in Brazil. Reports about the Himarima include images of objects found in their living areas and stories from members of other tribes about random encounters with them. Their language belongs to the Arawan language family, spread in western Brazil and Peru. In 1943, the tribe's population was over 1,000 people, but no one knows how populous it is today. Although the Himarima have had rare contact with the outside world over the past 80 years, they continue to avoid any sustained interactions with outsiders. Interestingly, they display extreme hostility even towards other tribes. Who knows? Perhaps such aggression is driven by a survival instinct to avoid diseases to which the Himarima lack immunity. However, this is a weak argument, since other tribes are much friendlier. Furthermore, contacts do occur, sometimes in unexpected and tragic circumstances. For example, in October 2009, a plane with 11 people on board crash-landed in the middle of the Vale do Javari Valley. People from the Matis tribe found the crash site and reported the event to local authorities. They sent a rescue mission, which evacuated 9 survivors. They were lucky. If the plane had landed in the wilderness where the Himarima live, the fate of the survivors and the potential impact on locals would have been uncertain. The survivors could have been attacked by hostile aborigines, and the latter could have contracted diseases from the aliens. And then legends about demons on a flying dragon carrying a curse, that is, a disease, would be passed down from generation to generation. According to relatively recent data, the number of tribes avoiding contact with the outside world can reach 85 to 90. By this indicator, Brazil has surpassed Papua New Guinea, the former world leader in the number of isolated tribes. But let us remind you that they face a very real danger of extinction. Civilization continues to encroach, despite the imposed restrictions. The thirst for profit recognizes neither borders nor any cultural distinctiveness. The cruel irony is that these lands have already witnessed the horrific extermination of indigenous peoples during the so-called conquest of the New World. Then, the European conquerors were obsessed with gold, so much so that they were willing to take any risk or believe any legend as long as it mentioned this ill-fated metal. And of course, the most famous legend is that of El Dorado. The mysterious city where everything is made of gold, this king of metals and metal of kings. According to these stories, the city's wealth is so immense that its citizens embellish their houses with gold and even pave roads with it. Here, the inhabitants lack nothing and know no poverty. Many travelers and treasure hunters set out on expeditions to uncover the mystery of this enigmatic city, making great geographical discoveries in the process. They lost their illusions, money, health, and sometimes their lives in the jungles. As you probably know, the city, or even its ruins, have yet to be found. Why is the legend of El Dorado so resilient? Why has it managed to survive so many centuries? And why is it as popular as the legends of Shambhala, or even more so, Atlantis? It's not solely about gold and human avarice for wealth. Part of the secret lies in the fact that this legend is the most plausible one. Wait, what? Does El Dorado really exist? Let's take it one step at a time. The first rumors of El Dorado were spread by Spanish seafarers who were probably mistaken for gods by the indigenous people. They were brought to their land and hospitably treated to a feast with golden dishes. The locals regarded gold as a common metal, calling it the sweat of the sun. But the visitors were well aware of its worth back in their homelands. The natives' relaxed attitude towards gold was most likely misinterpreted. Although the indigenous people also valued gold for its jewelry properties, they didn't idolize it as the outlanders did. The foreigners concluded that the locals were indifferent to gold because they had it in abundance here, and they weren't entirely wrong. There's a theory that the Europeans witnessed a ritual that cemented their belief in the existence of cities entirely made of gold somewhere. We're talking about a ceremony performed by the Muisca Indians, who once inhabited the shores of Lake Guatavita, situated on the periphery of the Amazon basin in present-day Colombia. This almost perfectly round lake is nestled in the crater of an extinct volcano, around 3,000 meters above sea level, with a depth of 125 meters. The Muisca's leader initiation ceremony involved some special actions. The future leader was anointed with coconut oil and generously sprinkled with gold dust. Hundreds of gold ornaments were loaded onto his raft. In the middle of the lake, he ceremoniously lowered all the treasures into the depths, left the raft, and swam slowly towards the shore. According to rumors that reached the Spaniards, this is what the leader initiation looked like in the Muisca tribe. In addition, the legend had tangible proof, not about the city, but about the ritual. The fact is that the leader initiation ceremony took place every year. You don't have to be a genius to assume the obvious. Over time, immeasurable golden treasures must have accumulated at the bottom of the lake. This is what the Spaniards thought, who in the 16th century embarked on the first expedition to the mysterious lake. Even though this expedition was purely exploratory, it had quite a good catch. Several dozen gold jewelry pieces were found on the muddy shores of the lake. Encouraged by their success, the Spaniards immediately set off to the shores of the lake again, this time better equipped. But there was no more gold on the shore. All that remained was the lake itself, or rather, its bottom. The conquistadors forced Native Americans to scoop out the lake. As ludicrous as it sounds, this is exactly what happened. Hundreds of locals passed buckets of water to each other in a human chain. The water was passed up the rocky shore, where it was dumped over the rocky cliff. This Sisyphean labor continued daily for 3 months. The level of the lake dropped by a measly few centimeters, yielding just a handful of gold ornaments. Realizing the effort was futile, the Spaniards called off this inhumane operation. The next treasure hunt took place 40 years later, in 1580. The wealthy Spanish merchant Antonio de Sepulveda attempted a more technologically competent and thorough approach to looking for gold at the bottom of the lake. With the help of the same indigenous people, some say there were 8,000 of them, he dug a deep trench in the mountainside to drain the water. And indeed, the water level dropped by as much as 3 meters. But there were very few gold pieces found on the exposed slopes, and it was still a long way to the bottom. 125 meters is no joke. In addition, the walls of the trench constantly collapsed. The pumping process slowed down, and the natives scampered in different directions. The merchant had to abandon his large-scale search, leaving Lake Guatavita unconquered once again. In the 17th and 18th centuries, the lake remained untouched, its tranquility undisturbed. Only the famous naturalist Alexander von Humboldt managed to calculate that if the legend is true, about 500,000 gold ornaments should be hidden at the lake's bottom, a treasure trove of astronomical value. These calculations inspired the English at the end of the 19th century, who made the last and most ambitious attempt to drain the lake a few years later. They even established a joint stock company, raising loan funds of £30,000 sterling. In 1912, the expedition arrived at the shores of the lake, equipped with several powerful steam pumps. Once they were set up on the shore, the work began. After several weeks of pumping, the lake level dropped by 12 meters, exposing a considerable part of the bottom. But nature played a cruel joke on the English. Under the scorching South American sun, the muddy ground baked and hardened to the point where it was barely softer than cement. There was no technical capacity to dig into it. As for the findings, the lake once again teased the explorers, rewarding them with fewer than a dozen golden statues. The joint stock company went spectacularly bust. The level of the lake quickly rose, and everything went silent once again. The last time the lake made the news was in the 1960s, when a large golden statue was found on its shore, depicting a man on a raft surrounded by 12 idols. Of course, this immediately intrigued all the adventurers throughout the world, but the Colombian government, terrified of the impending massive influx of treasure hunters, promptly declared the lake a national reserve. Since then, the lake's peace remains undisturbed, except for the occasional enthusiasts in wetsuits with scuba gear, but they are quickly caught and heavily fined. Thus, the sacred lake of the Muisca stands majestic and untouched, staunchly guarding its treasures against human greed. So what about El Dorado? Where is this mysterious city after all? According to a rather convincing theory, the origin of the toponym El Dorado comes from legends about the very ritual of gold dust anointing. The Spaniards called the leader in such a transitional state El Hombre Dorado, which simply means golden man. Over time, legend by legend, the phrase transformed into El Dorado, that very lake where the chief's initiation ritual took place became the prototype of the mysterious golden city of El Dorado. So yes, it seems that El Dorado is indeed located right here.